mistaken. I hit him up and I'm taking over. Mix the two with the bacon. So
Black Lives Matter.
You know, it's a controversial question and an issue right now. I'll take you back in reference to BLM. So when Black Lives Matter first started, it was chaotic. What I mean by that is that anyone could claim Black Lives Matter when it first started. It could be oppression in California, and you could be an advocate for Black Lives Matter. It could have been a beating, police beating in New York. It could have been wrongful death in Texas, and you could claim Black Lives Matter. It was a very organic movement, and it was based amongst in the urban backdrop with African Americans standing up saying enough is enough. That these communities had been oppressed and beaten and shot, killed in the streets for years with no one advocating for the ceaseless, senseless activities and deaths. When it first came along, I was encouraged that finally we had returned to advocacy. But in classic movement of the left, individuals like George Soros and Ford came on, and they saw what we didn't. What they saw was an opportunity when we saw was an obstacle. What I mean by that is, if you looked at what was happening during the birth of BLM, a lot of the activities that were happening, these horrible activities that were happening, they were in the cities that were led by Dems. Every city where there was a Black Lives Movement riot or a Black Lives Movement protest, it was in a city that was governed by the left. And we missed it. It would have been a perfect opportunity for us to bring reason into the argument and really help people to see that whenever you are led by the left, chaos is not far behind. Oppression is not far behind. Beatings are not far behind. Unrest is not far behind, because that is what the fruit of abandoning reason and abandoning morality and abandoning the rights of people does. We didn't jump on that. We could have, but people like the Clintons beat us to it. If you look at YouTube, there was a post between Clinton and a Black Lives Matter female, and this female, she's amazing. She engaged Clinton with serious questions, and it was independent of parties. You know, here was an individual that was solely engaged in the issue, and Clinton had no answer for her. She was totally exposed, and frustrated. Out of frustration, she argues with the female, and eventually she says, "Well, who are your leaders? Who are your leaders?" It wasn't long after that George Soros and Ford created a foundation called the Black Lives Movement Foundation, and they asked several individuals from different states to meet with them, and they deemed these individuals leaders, Black Lives Matter leaders, and they formulated an agenda and a plan, and the blacks that were there had to agree to that plan, and if they did, they would give them tens upon millions of dollars to support Black Lives Matter. And these makeshift leaders were born and agreed to things like to being against charter schools and advocating against charter schools on the local and state level. Even though 72 to 74% of African Americans actually are for charter schools and alternative education and academies. It didn't make sense. Why would so-called black leaders, part of the Black Lives Matter movement, now advocate against what black people actually stood for? It wasn't long before that we saw NAACP come up with a national memoriam against charter schools. The NAACP, when it went totally against what the polls say African Americans, blacks in America truly want, which is better education, even if that education is alternative to the public schools that are failing them. Another thing that these people agreed to would be to be against Israel. Now, I have no idea when the fight between the black community and Israel ever started, but this is something that they agreed to. They also agreed to supporting Planned Parenthood. I don't know when African Americans ever agreed to that abortion was a form of birth control. But it is because of this concept, this liberal ideology, that the African American population is at a standstill and is projected to actually decrease in its population or stay stagnant by 2040. I'm very concerned with why a Black Lives Matter movement will be led by white liberals who don't care about black issues. I think X said it best, and he talked about foxes. And foxes always appear as though they are your friend because they have a smile on their face. But that smile is deceptive. That smile is not a friendly one. It's a ploy. It's a ruse. And the closer you get to them, before you know it, you would have already been beaten, and your community will already have died. And when you think about the beginnings of BLM, I can't help but feel a little ashamed that we allowed liberals to take something that really had a Republican tint to it, where we could have advocated for civil rights, and we could have advocated that those liberal-led cities stop ignoring the rights of individuals, regardless of color. It is a platform and an ideology and a belief that we had stood for since our inception, and yet we missed it. And the outcome is that BLM has now become another liberal movement that started with great potential. And where it'll go from here, I don't know. But maybe in some respects, we allowed it to happen. No disregard to Blue Lives Matter or the All Lives Matter movement. No disrespect to any of those movements, but when we allow for opportunity to pass us by, I can be a bit concerned.
No mistaken, I hit him up and I'm taking over.